I'll start by giving you an outline of the kind of speaker events we attend. So we mostly go out to either CLPs or trade union branches. We occasionally get something a little bit more sort of unusual, like we sometimes get invited to like democracy days or rallies and things like that. Sometimes you'll get like we had a big rally in Liverpool just before COVID that was organised by it was an NHS support group, and it was mostly nurses protesting against cuts, but they had lots of really interesting speakers on different subjects, and so we sent a speaker to that to talk about PR, which was great. You sometimes get cross-party events where they want specifically a Labour speaker or specifically a trade union speaker to go and talk alongside a speaker from another organisation. Sometimes there'll be like events like festivals, like Southampton always do a May Day rally. Quite often they want a speaker to talk about PR. So events like that, but mostly it will be CLP and trade union branches. The kind of reception you tend to get, it tends to be a good one, actually. We've got, where we've had motions debated in CLPs, there's like a 97% pass rate for the motion being voted on. So it's very, you won't be going into like a hostile environment ever. You may get, at some events, you may get somebody who is, fiercely pro first past the post, but it's very unusual for people not to be, comradely. It's tends to be a friendly affair, and you might get some people pushing some tricky questions here and there, which we can talk about a bit later on. But generally, I love going out speaking to CLPs. It's like one of the nicest parts of my job, and unfortunately we've got too many speakers now, so I don't get to do it so much anymore. But yeah, it's great. And trade unions as well. It's trade unions are slightly different in that it's not a bread and butter issue, but then the people who tend to attend trade union branches tend to be interested in a good debate, so you still get an interesting conversation. Sam, do you want to talk about your experiences because you've done an awful lot of speaking events as well?
Yeah, no, by and large it's always really good. I find even if you get some tricky customers, I find that these things always go quite well. People are friendly because they've invited you to come to speak to their CLP. So you might get some real curveball of questions, but by and large, people are really friendly, really welcoming, and really want to learn more normally if they've asked a speaker along. So it's normally a really positive experience.
Yeah, and the other thing to say is we were doing all of these speaker events in person pre-COVID, and it was very unusual to be invited to an online event pre-COVID. Since COVID, I know some meetings have gone back to real life, but actually we're finding we're still getting invited to online events more often than not. So we're not really, even though CLPs are meeting in real life, if they're bringing in a speaker, they tend to be looking to do that on Zoom anyway. So it makes it much more practical in terms of, sort of not having to travel around the country. I haven't had to go to North Wales for a while, so which is, always a bonus. Although North Wales is very lovely, it's just, the round trip can be a bit tricky sometimes. But yeah, so I'm mostly online. As life returns to more normality, you might find that actually you've got some real life events which are also very nice, actually, because you get a chance to go and see how other CLPs operate, and you get to go and meet other trade union branches and things like that. So it's a good opportunity there as well. So I think we won't do breakout rooms for this evening. So I think what we'll do is, if I pass to you, Sam, if you want to do your CLP talk, and then once you've finished, I'll hop in with some trade union additions and maybe some tricky questions afterwards.
Sure, that's fab. Just as a quick FYI, I have hit the recording button just because we'll probably use this video for training purposes, just for later events.
Does anybody have any issues with that, actually? Because we can always edit it from this point onwards if needs be. No, excellent.
Fabulous. In which case, what I'll do now is I will give my CLP talk that I normally do about PR, but it will be a slightly condensed version to keep it short. And then after that, we'll do some questions, talk about what sort of tricky things come up at CLPs. But without further ado, I will give my talk. So here we go. Hello, my name's Samuel Kint. I'm here tonight speaking on behalf of Labour for a New Democracy and the Labour campaign for electoral reform. Before I start, I'm just going to quickly pop a sign up link in the chat. So if anyone during this talk decides they want to find out more about the campaign, you can just sign up on this link and you can find out more. But thank you very much for having me. And without further ado, I will do three things in this talk. I will explain what proportional representation is. I will explain the problems of first past the post, explain where the debate in the Labour Party currently stands. So what is proportional representation? Broadly speaking, it's any system of democracy in which parliamentary seats broadly match the popular vote. There are many different systems of PR, such as top-up systems or single transferable vote systems, but broadly speaking, most PR systems have a clear constituency link retained. And PR is the norm for most democracies, so I think it's about 85% of OECD nations use some form of proportional democracy, and only around 45 countries around the globe use first past the post, our system, and mainly that's because they've inherited it from us as a legacy of empire. And within Europe, only the UK and Belarus use first past the post, with every other country using some form of proportional system. So, what then is first past the post? In our current system, we have 650 constituencies that elect a single member to parliament to represent the local area. These representatives are part of parties and form governments, and it seems simple, fair, and straightforward. However, once you start to dig into it a bit, it starts to become deeply problematic. Well, on a surface level, it's very problematic because how can one MP represent the views of a constituency? The places we live, they're not monopolitical areas. Communities are complex and have a variety of views. I mean, if you're a Labour voter in Jacob Rees-Mogg seat, I think you're certainly not represented in Parliament under our current system. Under a PR system, your constituencies in some form would have more than one MP to represent the views of a local area, which makes a certain amount of sense because we live in diverse communities. But going further than that, further than just the basic level of first past the post, it provides hugely undemocratic results. Parliament isn't representative of how the population votes. Not only does the distribution of seats not match the popular vote, but most votes go unrepresented. In 3 of the last 5 general elections, the majority of votes were cast for losing candidates. That means that the majority of people in this country are not represented by an MP they voted for. In a real democracy, we should be able to expect to be represented by someone we actually voted for. And all of this doesn't consider something very important, which is the impact of safe and marginal seats on voters and activists. Come a general election, parties understandably focus on marginal seats, as that's where an election is won or lost. However, this actually has profoundly negative impacts. Most of the country is ignored, as most seats can be considered safe. Party policy is not dictated to what can win the broadest possible appeal, but ultimately is focused on less than 100,000 swing voters in marginal seats that determine the election outcome. Activists are regularly bussed away from their neighbourhoods to constituencies that they don't know, where they can target people whose votes matter most. That's the sad truth of first past the post. Where you happen to live determines the value of your vote. Nor can first past the post deliver one really basic outcome that a democracy should expect, which is the party that gets the most votes wins the most seats. In 1951, after creating the NHS, Clement Attlee's Labour government increased its number of votes to the highest share Labour has ever had, yet the Tories still won the election on a fewer number of votes. The fact is that first past the post and all majoritarian systems of democracy have a pronounced right-wing bias. In the UK, in 19 of the last 20 general elections, we have voted to the left of the Conservatives, yet the Conservatives have been in power for 2/3 of that time. And that's a pattern repeated across the globe. It happens because left-wing parties tend to have their support concentrated in urban areas. This means Labour votes build up to huge margin in safe seats, meaning you get less MPs for your vote share. For instance, at the last election, the 5 central Manchester seats had majorities so huge that an average of their vote would have equated to 4 additional Labour MPs. In contrast, the Tory vote is spread out relatively evenly efficiently across rural and suburban constituencies, giving them a greater chance of winning more seats. And that's why Labour needs a poll lead of over 10% to get a majority of 1, whereas the Tories need only a 3% lead. Structurally, the system has an inbuilt bias against us. Now, let's be clear, PR is not a silver bullet. If we change our voting system, we're not going to suddenly live in some socialist utopia. We're still going to have to contend with loads of issues. We're going to have to deal with negative media coverage, a divided voter base, and many, many more issues. However, PR would fundamentally change the nature of power in the UK. every vote mattering equally would be one of the largest single acts of empowering workers across the UK. No matter where you lived, your vote would be just as impactful in the election. That means parties would no longer focus resources on negative campaigning on small number of swing marginals, but actually parties would start to campaign positively on the quality of their arguments. Ultimately, PR doesn't create Labour governments, but it's a major step in levelling the electoral battlefield. It means the progress we make in government can't be scrapped by the next decade of Conservative rule. So, where's the Labour Party on this issue? 83% of the members are in favour of PR. 327 CLPs have passed motions in favour of PR. I hope your CLP will soon join them. 153 CLPs have sent motions to PR on conference last year, at which 80% of delegates backed the motion. Sadly, the unions voted against defeating the motion, but that wasn't really their fault. It was mainly due to COVID having meant that they couldn't have their policy conferences to discuss this. And we saw a month after Labour conference, Unite the Union, Labour's biggest affiliate, came out strongly against first past the post. And we have motions going to various union conferences this coming year. So hopefully we're going to see a big shift in the unions in the next 12 months. And then amongst the Parliamentary Labour Party, around 25% of the party are pro, about half are sort of undeclared, waiting to see where the leadership goes, and only around 20% are solidly against, with only very few of them really willing to go out on a limb and say so. And ultimately, electoral reform is unfinished business for the Labour Party. The last Labour government began a process of democratic renewal with the start of devolution and Lords reform, whereas in contrast, the Tories are trying to roll that back with voter ID, restrictions on our right to protest, and returning mayoral elections to first past the post. We need to embrace Labour's legacy to reform. We need to embrace Labour's legacy of democratic reform to address the democracy deficit we faced. So, as I finish speaking, I'm just going to quickly post some links in chat again. There, sign up once for our model motion, and another one shows where motions have been passed. And the final link is to our Many Not the Few report, which is a bit of more in-depth reading, which you can get your teeth into if you're interested. Thank you very much for having me to speak. I'd love to have some Q&A and discuss with you what you all think.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was a whistle-stop tour of the kind of speech that would be given at CLP. I see David nodding because I know David's done a few talks at CLPs as well. If okay, I'll just add a few trade union slides to that. Just the trade union talk, I would loosely give slightly less Labour facing. I wouldn't particularly go towards any other party. I would move it slightly away from the Labour Party and slightly more about democracy, but loosely the same talk that Sam's just given. And I would also include some, let me just see if I can share some screens and share some slides. Let me see, I can do that. Can you all see my screen okay? And has it still got, right, let's see, does that make, is that clear to everybody?
It looks good.
Fabulous. So yeah, I would include a little bit about trade unions as well. So I've just jumped in halfway through my slides, which we'll send to you as a follow-up, but to talk a little bit about what PR can do for the trade unions. So a Labour government needs a seat at the table to reverse restrictive trade union laws. The current system disadvantages the Labour Party, a disadvantage which in all likelihood will continue to grow. The research, the evidence suggests that with first past the post, that right-wing bias continues to grow. On average, proportional democracies tend to have more government ministers from Labour parties, which is 35% of ministers, compared with majoritarian first past the post countries, which is 23%. You get the values. A more proportional system aligns with the values of many trade unions, and ultimately trade union goals are a fair and equal representation of the voters. This is a lovely graphic that's from the ITUC Global Rights Index. Now, what you can see here is your green represents your PR countries, your yellow is a mixed system or a flawed PR system, and your red is a majoritarian system. And you can see you're looking for no guarantee of rights, which is yellow to the far side, which is your mixed flawed PR systems. Systematic violations of rights, which is majoritarian and again mixed flawed PR. Regular violation of rights, you're seeing a little bit of PR nudging in there, but mostly it's majoritarian, mixed and flaws. Repeated violations of rights, you've got mixed and flawed and majoritarian still in there, a few more PR. But when you're looking at the most sporadic violation of rights, that's your PR system. The UK is graded at 3, which is regular violations of rights. But it's, I mean, ideally, we don't want any violation of workers' rights. But when you're looking at the worst offenders, they're countries that use majoritarian or PR systems. This is also another stat that I use. I talk a lot about New Zealand, and the reason I do so is not because necessarily New Zealand is very similar to the UK, but New Zealand is a country that has switched from first past the post to PR within the last 30 years. And it really is clearest example of what happens when a country switches from first past the post to PR in recent times. And here you can see this is positive minus negative mentions of trade unions or workers' rights in the manifesto of not just the New Zealand Labour Party, but also the New Zealand National Party. Where this black arrow is in the middle, that's where they switched to proportional representation. And you can see how the mention of unions and workers' rights has increased, but not just in the Labour Party, also in the National Party. So you can see how the trade unions are getting much more clout within, you know, sort of manifesto commitments. And that pattern is sort of, it continues. There's some examples within New Zealand, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you can look at what happened when you get the change of system. You've got pre-PR, this is what the governments look like. There was 97% was a National Party, 33% the Labour Party. Since switching to PR, you've got that 55 to 45%. So it's, you know, and that should, you know, sort of continue to level out so that you do tend to end up with the inverse. So when you look at globally, countries that use first past the post and majoritarian systems tend to look like the pre-PR one of New Zealand. Countries that use PR tend to look like the exact inverse of it, more or less. It tends to be, you know, sort of 75 to 25-ish %. So it's really an interesting inverse. Some of the things we've seen in New Zealand since they've switched to PR in terms of sort of trade unions, and you know what effects the reforms have had. We've got fairer and more proportional election results, as shown by the last slide, more representation of ideologically diverse smaller parties, but the traditional big two parties do still continue to dominate and always lead the governments. You end up with a higher trust in government. That kind of political efficacy is no longer in decline. You see more representation of women and ethnic minorities. The last slide showed about the National Party, where it was in power and where it is now. One of the other things they sort of found is that, you know, the key drivers of electoral reformers had all been met. And one of the things they did in New Zealand was they offered a referendum to see if New Zealand would like to go back to using first past the post, and the country said no thank you, you know. So it's and how it's had an impact on the unions is the relationship between the New Zealand Labour Party and the trade unions has grown closer since the introduction of PR. It makes sense because, you know, the trade unions have got much more of a seat at the table because the New Zealand Labour Party have got much more of a seat at the table. Throughout the 1980s, what you saw was successive Labour and national government pushing neoliberal reforms, which undermined the trade unions' traditional base. You've seen that in the UK as well. The National Party government introduced some of the most individualistic Labour legislation in the world in 1991. So throughout the 1990s, the Labour Party started to rebuild its relationship with the unions. New Zealand introduced PR in 1996 onwards. In 1999, under PR, Labour formed a government with the left-wing Alliance Party, and they repealed the National Party's trade union legislation. And what that's seen is, since then, we've seen legislation being introduced on paid parental leave, breastfeeding, flexible working relationships. You know, you've seen some really, really good union legislation being introduced. I'm going to stop there in terms of stop screen sharing as well. But that would be the sort of trade union argument that would be added. I mean, obviously the talk would be tailored so that it wasn't quite as long. But yeah, so that's the sort of trade union arguments. We can come on and chat a little bit about the sort of difficult questions, because that will be the sort of final thing that you're likely to hear is, you know, the sort of difficult questions that people may ask. I don't know if anybody wants to, I'm aware you've heard a lot of Sam and I talking. I don't know if anybody would like to chip in with the kind of difficult questions you would expect to hear, you know, or things that you might be worried about people asking. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and...
Funny enough, I've actually got the motion going, my CLP on Monday. And they passed the motion last year, although not the conference motion, which went to housing. So I've been asked to do a 5-minute presentation and to make the case for affiliation to the LCER. So the questions I've got to answer are, well, how will it help strengthen the case for electoral reform? So you've already mentioned that in terms of it will give more power to the LCER. And I can probably come up with 1 or 2 bits for that as well. But certainly in terms of the affiliation part, which you suggested earlier, I can do that. What would our CLP get out of it? And I think that would reverse, I mean, I would say to the general points overall of the benefits of a cooperation, collaboration, etc. Some of the more main points of PR. To the individual CLP, I would say where I am, because it will always be blue. I think, I mean, for us, it's sort of when we canvass, it will mean something under PR. Whereas presently, I mean, we make the effort, but it's walking around the streets for what reason, sort of thing, really, to be putting it really bluntly. So there's a lot of relevance for if you're in a seat which is forever blue. Because I think that really gives a lot of meaning, and it really can really drive a lot of motivation within the CLPs, because all the work you do will count. And also actually very practical, is there a cost for affiliation? Which I don't know.
So a few things there. The first one, the affiliation to LCR, we talked about the fact that, you know, LCR are looking to affiliate to the Labour Party, and the more CLPs they have affiliated to them, the easier that is, you know, sort of.
Oh, okay.
So it benefits them, but it also means that you become part of a bigger something. So you're with all the affiliated CLPs, and you've affiliated to this campaign, and you've, you know, sort of committed to this campaign as being, you know, something that your CLP cares about. So there's that kind of, you know, being part of something bigger. The cost, I believe, is £10 a year. It's not very much. Sam, is that right? Am I right in thinking that? Yeah. So you can do it on the website. It's not expensive. Sure. It's minimal. So, and you also mentioned about the, you know, sort of things that were important to you. What I would say, whenever you're going out speaking to a CLP, is to do your homework first. You know, certainly look up the CLP, look up the demographic, look up the MP, check for any Wikipedia scandals. It's always really helpful if you're going into a CLP and you know that they've got a Tory MP who's been involved in, you know, some kind of expenses scandal or something like that, because you can make reference to it in your speech, and it's a nice thing for the CLP to hear that you've actually bothered to do your homework, and that, you know, and it kind of endears you to them if you know they really are not impressed with how their MP behaves, and you're picking up that their MPs behave very badly. You know, and that kind of works. It works both ways as well. If you're going to a CLP where they actually have a reasonable MP, and, you know, who's doing the right things, you know, or you're in a marginal seat and you're talking about, you know, you want to tailor your talk to talk about marginals. If you're in a marginal, if you're in a safe seat, you probably want to tailor it to talk about safe seats. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. Elaine, did you want to come in? You're muted, Elaine. No.
Yes, thank you. Is anyone else here from Wales?
Ben, are you putting your hand up to say you're from Wales?
Ben.
I wasn't sure how this worked. I just put my hand up so I can ask a question at some point. But
okay, right.
I'm not from Wales. I'm not from Wales.
You just put it up at beautifully timed.
I was hoping. So obviously there are some different factors here in Wales. I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody who's a Unite member. I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I can think of some arguments that I'll get thrown up. So Wales has always had the Labour Party in power since time immemorial. So that argument won't particularly wash here. We already have a partial single transferable vote system for our regional Senedd elections. So our regional representatives are elected under that system. And what we have seen with that is that it has tended to favour some of what I would call the extreme right parties, like the ghastly UKIP. So if I'm going to talk about this, and I have just been elected the chair of our Cardiff region, which is obviously the largest region in Wales in terms of numbers, for the Unite retired members, who are not known for their progressiveness, I will need some specifics tailored to the Welsh situation, information, and I'm also going to have something to counter those specific points which are bound to come up. Now, earlier you mentioned, Samuel, that Unite has voted against first past the post, but have they voted for PR? Because that's quite different, isn't it?
Shall I take that one?
Go for it.
When the motion went to Unite, that was written pre-COVID. It was written pre-Labour conference. It was written when pre-Sharon Graham.
Okay.
It was written because Len McCluskey wasn't very pro-PR, and we had an EC that was a mixed bag. So we wrote a very gentle motion that called for Unite to reject first past the post and to commit to a different kind of voting system and to commit to looking into a different kind of voting system. So it is not an all singing, all dancing Unite wants PR, but it is an all singing, all dancing Unite does not want first past the post. Unite wants to look into a new voting system. What happened once they passed that was that Sharon Graham came out on Twitter and said that Unite backs PR. So it's really ambiguous. What you can't do is go to Unite and go, Unite's got policy in favour of PR, because it makes us look daft.
Yes, okay. No, that's clear.
I can send you a copy. I'll make a note and I will send you a copy of the, I'll send you an actual copy of the motion. So there's a few things that you mentioned. I totally sympathise. I'm not sure if you were on the call earlier, but I made a joke about not having to drive to North Wales anymore. But it used to be me that would go into the Welsh-speaking events.
It's quicker for you to drive to North Wales than it is for me, and I live in Wales.
Well, maybe not quite, because I'm down on the south coast, but it would be me that would drive around the country. Probably about the same, yeah. But yeah, so I can totally sympathise. It is because you already have PR. I mean, there's a few things. First off, because Wales has PR, you get people who would say, well, actually, it lets in the troublemakers, it lets in UKIP, it's a problem. The first thing I would always say in Wales, in a Welsh setting, is that you're looking at a devolved assembly that has PR working under a Westminster system that's under first past the post. So actually, if Westminster had PR, you would see a greater balance for the whole of the UK. But what you're actually seeing is a greater representation in Wales and Scotland than you've got in England, and same for Republic of Ireland. But they're all being, sort of led and largely financed by Westminster, which is run under first past the post. So you've got this kind of, they've got a bit of freedom, but it's not actually enough freedom, because it's still tethered to Westminster. So there's that side of it. With the far right, that is something you will hear, whether you're in Wales or whether you're anywhere else. It's that kind of, and you'll especially get it in trade unions, actually. The rise of the far right is a problem under PR.
No, I will.
You'll hear that. Now, to counter that, first off, I would talk about the current government, because actually when you've got people like Jacob Rees-Mogg getting a regular sounding board, and you've got, you know, sort of some of your ERG Tories who are really quite regressive in their views, and these people are being given airtime, it becomes the tail that wags the dog. So you've got that kind of extreme section of the Tory party, of which Boris Johnson appears to be one right now. You know, you've got that kind of extreme section, and people think that that
Here's
is
the dog.
Hello, dog. But people think because you've got that, you know, sort of, that's where everybody who's voting Tory agrees with that kind of politics, when actually you've got some people who will just always vote Tory regardless. And, you know, they might find Nigel Farage's shade of politics absolutely abhorrent, but they'll still go and vote Tory, even if the Tories are doing what Nigel Farage is telling them to. You know, so you've got that vote is bolstered by your kind of moderate Tory vote. So you've got all of that kind of issue. There's also, did you want to jump in, Sam? I was going to say sunlight's the best disinfectant, but I think you might be about to say that as well.
I was. So I've spoken to a few Welsh CLPs recently, and what I found quite a helpful point on the extremism is if you look at the Zenith, at the last election, all the UKIP MSs didn't get re-elected. There were 5 of them for 5 years, and they spent that time standing up, saying quite extreme things, breaking apart, forming new groups, becoming independents. And at the end of that 5 years, none of them got re-elected, because ultimately sunlight's the best disinfectant. And if you let extremism get, if you give a voice to what people vote for, and it turns out it's insane, it's a lot less likely to get re-elected. And it's a lot less likely to then lead to the sort of the feeling of being left behind and voicelessness that happens under first past the post.
Yeah, and the other important thing to remember about Wales at the moment is that they're going through a consultation process to look at the voting system, to actually attempt to make it a bit more proportional, because in terms of proportional systems, it is PR, it's way more proportional than Westminster, but it's not the best kind of PR that you could possibly have. So it's not as proportional as it could be. So they're going through a process at the moment where they're looking at tweaking it to make it better. What they're not looking at doing is reintroducing first past the post, and that's really important. There is no one is calling to reintroduce first past the post in Wales. Certainly not, you know, anyone who has any say in the constitution. There might be people who favour it, but, you know, on the whole, it's, you know, it's a tweak. It's not a removal. Is that helpful?
Yes, no, it is. And I don't want to hog the conversation, because this won't be relevant for all other people. But what will be good is if you can pull that together in some form that will be useful, you know, specifically for here in Wales. In case I have the opportunity to, you know, initially get this onto the agenda for a future meeting, because we are now able to meet in Transport House in Cardiff from March. So from April. So our next meeting will be an in-person hybrid sort of one. So what I'm hoping is that we can start to get some issues onto the agenda, and maybe then start to introduce them more broadly. I've not kept pace with what the political situation is within Unite in Wales, so I'm going to need to find that out beforehand to be well informed. As David was saying earlier, you need to know about the specifics so that you're not caught out when you're presenting this kind of information.
And I'm fairly sure we've got some Welsh specific information sheets that we can send across to you. I'm trying to think, are they current and up to where if they're not current and up to where they need to be, we can work on them and make them current and up to where they need to be. And that's certainly something we can look to send across to you, Elaine. So.
Okay, thank you.
Fab. Ben, did you want to hop in?
Yes, thanks, Caroline. I'll just lower my hand if I can work out how to.
Do you want me to do it for you?
Yes, I got it. I worked it out.
Oh, we did it together, and now I've put it back up. I'll sort it.
Oh, okay. I mean, that your response to Elaine's questions were very helpful for me, because I'm up in Scotland. So quite a lot of what will apply to Wales is going to apply to Scotland. So I won't ask a Scottish focused question. I'm going to ask about the kinds of awkward questions that could come up. And one of them seems to me, I mean, a place which I work in a lot, travel to for work a lot, is Germany. So I know the political system there quite well. And there, because you've got a proportional system, Smaller parties have been able to branch off and grow. So you've got, from the centre to the left, you got the Free Democrats, Social Democrats, you got the Left Party and the Greens. And because a proportional system allows smaller parties to grow, you hear a lot of voices saying, "Oh, if we had PR, it would be the end of the Labour Party; it would split." How do you counter that kind of point, that kind of question when people ask it?
I think I'll probably jump in here because I'm quite familiar with the German system myself. Right. If I'm asked about PR is the end of the Labour Party, we'll split, we'll fracture into dozens of tiny parties, I'd first off point to New Zealand because they're similar to us in many ways, and actually they underwent a shift from first past the post to the PR 20, 30 years ago, and their Labour Party was in a fairly similar place to ours in terms of factionalism, and there were real concerns about PR causing a massive split. But because PR meant that it was viable for more centrist and the more left-wing party to split off from each other, it forced the factions to work together. Because they could split, it meant they worked hard not to split, which removed a lot of the toxicity.
Yeah,
I think it's the best way to approach that question.
Great. Thanks. I mean, I also just wondered, I mean, I would certainly be looking to make that point if I was asked about the danger of Labour splitting. But I think a couple of other things which I would probably say in argument to that is, even if you did get a split, the split needn't necessarily be acrimonious. It can be amicable. The parties can work together in government post-split. So, it's not, you've got German Greens and German Social Democrats working together well in government at the moment. So, it needn't be a destructive split. But another thing is you can split the Tories. And I mean, I like the idea, for instance, of the nutty UKippers or ERG types just being banished to the nether regions. And then you get the growth of a more sensible centre-right Christian Democrat style Conservative Party, which not the kind of party I'd vote for, but there's certainly the kind of party you could probably work with, and it would be much more a much more kind of sane, civilized kind of politics that would emerge if you had a party like that, which was able to shed its balmier elements and actually be a credible partner in government. At times, even under PR, you'd have a centre-right government. Far better to have that kind of Conservative Party heading it, which than the kind of Conservative Party we got at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I might be a bit. I wouldn't necessarily talk to a Labour audience about the Labour Party splitting. No. It might be that goes down a treat and people love the idea, but you've got to be a bit careful with the idea because it will turn some people off.
Sure.
What the rest of what you said about banishing the nutters to the corner, I think is a really good point, and I think it's well worth raising.
Okay,
there's a couple of things you can add to that as well. So we heard Professor Rob Ford from the University of Manchester speak recently, and he was saying that there's actually a fair bit of research that shows that under proportional representation, the right becomes much more fragmented, and under first past the post, the left becomes much more fragmented. And I also would say, when you're talking about banishing your, sort of parties that, we really wouldn't want to be giving a lot of limelight to, you can look at what's happened in Portugal this week, with the winning party going, we're going to deal with everybody apart from this one party, and they literally have, they've pushed them outside the circle. We'll work with everybody else. We'll be open to working with everybody else, but not you.
Yeah, good.
So I think, that does happen in reality. Mark, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
Oh, sorry.
Bit of advice, really. What's your view on when to your local party, which I'm about to do at some point in the next couple of months? Keep it entirely to electoral reform, or put, as many are suggesting in the wider debate, frame it within a wider, for want of a better word, constitutional change. In other words, I'd be really interested to know, maybe from someone like Sam, who's done a lot of it, whether that's tactically, I mean, I think it's really important tactically on a national level, because otherwise the accusation, which I think is the weakest point of this whole campaign coming from Labour, will be, because we've got to get it, you've eventually got to get it in the manifesto, otherwise you've got no mandate. well, you're only for this now because you can't win. You're coming off 4 defeats, and this is you desperate right now. So nationally, I think that's incredibly important. We therefore put it within we frame it within a wider package that we then don't have to go back and get a mandate for. But this is there's a narrower question about the tactical thing locally. In terms of, is it best to keep it really narrow, I suppose, in a sentence, or even at that level, would you broaden it out?
So I think it really depends on your CLP. As a rule of thumb, I'd normally focus solely on PR because, broadly speaking, we agree as a Labour Party on votes at 16, more devolution, all that sort of stuff. There's broad agreement. I'd frame your discussion along the lines of, we agree on all this really important stuff, but we haven't talked about PR, and it's a crucial thing that we need to discuss to have a comprehensive view of electoral reform as a whole. If you've got a CLP or a branch that is incredibly hostile, incredibly first past the post, till I die sort of impression, I would then maybe consider not trying to get them on board with PR, but softening them to be open. So okay. I would, in that context, I might put it in the context of, we need to consider PR alongside votes at 16 and this and this and this. But I'd only really do that in an extreme case of they all really hate PR.
Yeah, I would also add that we've had a fair few speakers who've used the analogy that PR is a key that opens the door to many other things. I will always, whenever I go to a CLP talk, I will always say that PR is not a panacea. It's definitely not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything. You know, we're not, you know, there's no one really within the electoral reform kind of field who thinks that PR is going to fix everything. But we know that it's a start point where you can start building on a better kind of democracy.
It's what economists would call a necessary but not sufficient condition, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Clive Lewis calls it the key to opening the door to other things, you know, and I think that's really important that you can, so, you know, even if you're going straight down a PR route, you can still very much stress that it's definitely not an end point, it's a start point to better things.
Yeah, that's helpful too, thanks.
David, did you want to chip in?
I was only, well, you've said it really, but I think it really is a single issue. And for those of us who are here, we're probably maybe quite interested in thinking about a constitution and various things. But the general the electorate out there, it needs to be kept very simple and very much PR is about the foundation of a new politics. It's transformational. It's as big as, I liken it to sort of the suffragette movement is about women getting the vote. It's as big as that. And that happened 100 years ago. And we need that transformation. And as Clive said, it's the key to everything else. And it's like constitution, reform of the Lords, that often comes up, or local government. But until we get PR at a national level, nothing will happen. And in the short term, it's getting the unions on board and obviously getting it onto the Labour Party manifesto. It's very single-minded as far as I'm concerned. And I always just reiterate that when I've done any talks.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's really helpful. I think, does anybody else have any other burning questions? Is there anything we haven't covered? Is there anything you'd like to know? I mean, we will send you out packs. We'll talk about what the next steps are if you want to sign up to our speaker program and you want to be one of our speakers that we send out. And I mean, what happens with that is Sam currently runs the speaker program. Do you want to give a brief overview of how it works, Sam?
Yeah, sure. So the next step, if you do want to talk, would be we'd arrange a date for which you would come having written a talk, and then you would give the talk to a group of sort of 3 or 4 of us, and everyone would give a talk, and then I'd give feedback on the talks to know what you could do better, and just sort of polish it up.
We did brilliantly as well.
And obviously,
we're a very positive bunch.
That's what Caroline wanted me to be positive. But so once we've done that, I'd then send you to either a union branch or a CLP or a CLP branch, and you'd give your talk there. And then after that, I'd touch base with you, ask how it went, and talk about what you thought went well, what you thought you could do better. And then we'd start sending you out sort of every month or two, depends on how many speaking requests we get, we'd start sending you out. And I often will send an email out asking, are you free to talk at this CLP on this date? Normally speaking on a Zoom call or something like that.
Fab. Ben, did you have a question about that?
Yeah, just wondered how long would the talk be for this kind of training? Yeah,
so normally when we give talks to CLPs, it'll be in the range of sort of 10 to 20 minutes. I'd normally advise people to have sort of a 10 to 15-minute presentation, because normally a Q&A is a lot more helpful than you talking at a room, but you need to do the talking at the room for a sufficient amount of time to then allow for a good level of discussion afterwards.
And what we'll send you is complete speaking notes, PowerPoint slides, all of which you can, we'll send you a variety. We've got like the politics for the many PowerPoint slides. We've got my slides, which I showed a minute ago. I think we've got some CLP slides as well. And we've got various different speaking notes as well, and kind of cheat sheets and information sheets. So we will send you a whole load of information, and then you can pick and choose what you want to use. And we just ask you to run through an overview of, the kind of talk you were going to give, just so we made sure that you weren't going to go out and say, we want PR because we want UKIP to have a better voice, like just in case.
Damn, rumbles.
Yeah, so that's sort of. David, did you have something you wanted?
I was only just going to say, but I limit mine to 10 minutes. I normally have a quick email with the whoever you're going to speak with, the branch secretary, whatever, and they say, "Oh, do you want to be introduced?" I think, "No, I'm David Westwood." I mean, for me, keep it simple. Just don't need an introduction particularly. 10 minutes, and then I always say, normally, I mean, Q&As will go on, can go on for a long time, and they're really interesting. And then I would often say, well, I definitely allow probably 30 minutes for Q&A, and then just ask for the chair to come back, and then just sort of slot you in accordingly. So yeah, but 10 minutes for me is max, really.
Yeah, you do definitely. I don't think I've ever done a speech or a talk where the talk has gone on longer than the questions. And it's generally, it is, people want to ask a lot of questions. So which we can definitely help you with. We can send you a list of frequently asked questions and frequently given answers. So what we'll do is we'll get an information pack all together to you, and we'll get that on a mail out. I would like to say I would get it out by the end of this week. We seem to have had a few things, sort of all hit at once this week. So it may be early next week, but I will get that all together for you and get that sent out. We've also recorded this session, so we will use it for future training, provided everybody's happy with that. Does anybody else have anything that they feel they need to know or like a bit more information on? No? In which case, I think we've finished 8 minutes early. So whoever had an 8 o'clock, you've got time to get yourself a cuppa beforehand. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll send you out a load of information. Elaine, I've taken lots of notes about specific Welsh information. Ben, I will find you some Scottish stuff as well for good measure. And if anybody's got anything where they think they specifically need information after we've sent the mail out, or even before, do get in touch, tell us what you need, and we'll definitely get in touch with you to see if you'd like to come back and chat some more about doing some speaker events, because we'd love to have you on board. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Cheers.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.